New from the Leader One Podcast Network, Straight from the Can, a guide to prison culture. How does the portrayal of prison in film and television stack up against its real-life equivalent? How do you survive in prison with your sanity intact? Join me, Morgan Rector, and my ex-con co-hosts, Raymond Hazen Jr. and Jason McMurray, as we delve into the truth of incarceration. Available on all podcast platforms. Welcome to Human Monsters. Every now and then I come across stories that, in their own right, are truly criminal and depraved, but they just don't have enough meat on the bone to stand on its own. Today I'm serving you 3 of these tales of men and the criminal cases that earned them a headline or 2 for a day, but then were mostly forgotten. The question I had in my mind long after I wrote each piece was that I wondered how each of the communities these men belonged to would recover after these types of scandals. I was amazed to find they did, which speaks to the resilience of human character. I am sure those who knew them or knew of them will be at least a little creeped out by the mention of their names, but as a society, it had become harder and harder to shock us into permanent repulsion. So, without further ado, I give you 2 cannibals and a vampire. You're welcome. Peter Curtin, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. I am revisiting this case because it is thematically consistent with the subsequent cases I will explore in this episode. Tell me, what turns you on? Is it a man's eyes, a woman's shape, or do you need a little more sensual stimulation to have the ultimate erotic pleasure? As consenting adults, most of us have experimented a little in the bedroom. These are not the dark ages, after all, and you really don't have to look far for sexual innuendos or straight-up blatant messages that a little experimentation in the bedroom will bring back passion in a relationship. Sex sells, and when sex gets boring, one of the first solutions is to bring a little kink between the sheets. For most people, a couple of furry handcuffs or a role-playing outfit would be enough. But what if what your partner wants from you is to make a small cut on your arm to suck your blood? Personally, this is not my thing, and far be it for me to yuck someone's yum, but the notion of being sexually aroused by even the sight of blood is incomprehensible. Still, I am the first to admit that it is easy for me to be swept away by the legends, myths, and stories about vampires that grace our silver screens, mostly in period drama settings, and with a romantic flavor. The truth of the matter is, however, that despite the fact that clinical vampirism, or Renfield syndrome, as it is known, is far less common, yet far more brutal than the tales we devour at the cinema. It would be impossible to tell how many victims there have been of prolific serial killers and vampires like Elizabeth Bathory, who believed that bathing in the blood of her victims would make her younger, or Vlad the Impaler, who was known to dip his bread in the blood of his dying enemies. When a sadist acquires a taste for blood, he or she will literally paint the town red with it. Fortunately, it's not the type of affliction or fetish that enthralls many. But as you will learn in today's tale, when a killer is literally thirsty for blood, it's a need that will not stop until he is caught. In the history of psychology and criminal behavior, the story of Peter Curtin is of great relevance. Not only will the first in-depth study of this phenomena be done, but the first ever profiler will also be born. Peter was, after his capture, very willing to share his life story as well as his thoughts and feelings. He would even allow Dr. Carl Berg to dissect his brain after death in order to find what specifically made Peter the man into Peter the monster, thereby effectively performing the very first psychological autopsy. The study into the crimes of Peter Curtin would later be bound into a book called The Sadist by Dr. Berg, and the name of the book encapsulates all that is Peter Curtin. He was a sexual sadist with an unquenchable appetite. He was a narcissist with a massive ego, and he was a psychopath with absolutely not a single feeling of empathy for anything or anyone. Facts around the number of victims he murdered vary between as many as 68 and 31, but we will focus in today's episode on the 9 victims he would eventually be convicted for. Apart from the hundreds of people he violently attacked, he also raped women and children at will. Buckle up, people, because I have yet to study a sexual sadist the likes of Peter Curtin, the Vampire of Dusseldorf. The first thought that entered my mind as I looked at the images of Peter Curtin was how much he reminded me of Adolf Hitler. Even in illustrations, you can tell there is hardly any emotion behind those cold eyes. What also enhances the legend of Peter Curtin is the description of an eloquent man, well-dressed and groomed with a sophisticated way about him. His acts, as we will see, completely contradict the mild-mannered family man Peter Curtin would present to the rest of the world. Like Richard Kuklinski and Dennis Rader, he blended into his environment with ease, portraying the family man. Only those who knew him well detected that beneath the dapper veneer, a predator without the capacity to feel anything for his fellow humans lurked. Peter Curtin was a German national born on the 26th of May, 1883, in Molheim, Cologne. His family was incredibly poor. The little we know about his domestic life is enough to foreshadow that the household was an unhealthy and unhappy place to raise children. Peter was the eldest of 13 children, of which 2 died while still young. The family shared a single room, and both Peter's father and mother were raging alcoholics. Peter's father also had a flammable temper that would ignite at the least provocation. None of the members of the family were exempt from the violent rages that would erupt in their small dwelling, and after beating Peter's mother and any other sibling that got in the way, his father would rape his mother and later his sister in front of the battered and bruised children. From the onset, Peter acquainted sex with violence. Peter would later admit to also raping his sister during his teenage years, furthering the cycle of incest. As a child, he was a good student, but he was reported to have tried to run away often. While loitering in the streets of Cologne, he would commit petty thefts and burglaries to buy food. It's been reported that when Peter was 9 years old, he went rafting with 2 friends. When his one friend fell into the water and could not swim, the second friend jumped in to rescue his companion. Realizing he would be unsuccessful in saving the first boy's life, the second child tried to get on board. But according to Peter, the urge to murder overtook him, and with faint amusement, he refused to let the boy on the raft and watched with glee as his little friend drowned. The 2 deaths have never been confirmed, but Peter Curtin does not strike me as someone who would embellish for notoriety during his confessions. For what it's worth, I believe the events did happen on the River Rhine, as Peter put forth in his statement. As if a dysfunctional home life filled with incest, rape, and violence is not enough of a fertile environment for a budding sociopath to be raised in, Peter managed to become friends with a dog catcher who happened to be renting an apartment in the same building. In the dog catcher, Peter found a soulless kindred spirit who seemed to also enjoy and derive enormous pleasure out of the pain of other living creatures. Peter would later in life recall how the dog catcher would laugh uncontrollably as he raped and killed the animals he caught. Peter had a girlfriend, but she would only allow him to undress and fondle her. Soon Peter was practicing bestiality, and he found that if he stabbed the animal, the euphoric feeling of ejaculation would be so much more intense. Although he had to stop after being caught, A spark in the prolific sex fiend was lit. He did continue to kill animals, from squirrels to geese, and every time he took the life of a living creature, the euphoria of ejaculation would feed the desires of an unstoppable sex fiend. The arrest of Peter's father came about when Peter, after becoming an apprentice at the same metalwork factory shop where his father worked, quickly decided that robbing both his new employer and his father sounded like a much better prospect than working for minimum wage. It was during the investigation into the theft that the rape and abuse came to light, and Peter's father was arrested for his deeds. Peter's father was eventually found guilty of incest, and he spent a measly 18 months in jail. His mother grabbed the opportunity to divorce her husband, and soon she remarried, moving Peter and the brood to Dusseldorf. Most of his crimes happened over a century ago, so it's difficult to determine which source is the most accurate, but it's safe to assume Peter started attacking random people, stabbing them with an assorted array of instruments of harm quite early in life. Unlike many other serial killers, he did not choose vagrants or streetwalkers to brutalize. To Peter, it did not matter who you are, because his victims were both sexes, various ages, and because he liked to switch it up, using a wide variety of weapons, the crimes were difficult to connect. He started working on his prison record young, and for the next 24 years, he would do time for everything from rape to robbery, but he specifically found himself unable to stop from setting the world on fire. From sheds to barns, from houses to forests, Peter found the dancing flames and cries of despair would immediately give him a boner, and without effort, he would ejaculate in his pants. Another famous sexual sadist, Otis Toole, would, almost a century later, try to explain to an interviewer how the sight of fire could get him rock hard in a moment. The sight, smells, sounds, and spectacle of arson would conjure up in these pyromaniacs an erotic thrill unlike any we can imagine. Peter would confess that, as he watched the structures burn, he hoped to hear the screams of a trapped victim. He set hundreds of fires, as many as 10 a night, and if it was safe enough, he would return to soak in the chaos and carnage he created. Peter's first confirmed kill came on the eve of his 19th birthday, on the 25th of May, 1913. Peter had begun to rob establishments where the shop is on the ground floor and the residence on the upper level. As Peter Klein and his wife tended to their customers, 9-year-old Christine Klein was fast asleep in her feather bed upstairs. Peter broke into the living quarters and, finding nothing valuable to steal, stumbled upon the unfortunate sleeping child. Although he claims that this is his first kill, the methodical and brutal attack speaks of someone who's done this before. First he throttled her and, as she lay unconscious, he made 2 incisions in her neck. The first fairly small, but the second almost 9 centimeters deep. The latter cut caused the blood to shoot in an arch over Peter's hand, and of course, in that moment, Peter ejaculated. According to the autopsy, Peter also inserted 2 of his fingers into her vagina, and it appeared that he had chewed off her tongue. It was, however, the flow of the dark red liquid that caused him the most divine pleasure, and since he had his perverted itch scratched, he left minutes after coming in his lederhosen. The following day, Peter could not resist going to the tavern across the road from the Klein dwelling, and, while enjoying a beer, he would inhale the drama and devastation his crime had created. Peter accidentally left his handkerchief at the scene, embroidered with his initials. But the devil indeed looks after his disciples, because Christine's father happened to have those very same initials. What further led police further away from the random stranger theory was dismissed due to the fact that Otto Klein, Christine's uncle, had been reported to have asked Peter Klein for money, and when he refused, Otto said that he was going to do something his brother would always remember. The case against Otto Klein did go to court, but he was acquitted due to a lack of evidence. The case split the Klein family apart, and a year after his acquittal, he would tragically die fighting for Germany in the First World War. While the Klein family was drowning in tragedy, Peter would visit little Christine's grave, and he would confess to Dr. Berg that, as he ran his fingers through the soil that housed her remains, he would get an erection and ejaculate. Peter attempted to stab to death a 17-year-old girl, Gertrude Franklin. She would survive the attempted murder, and before his killing spree could begin, he was drafted into the German army. Ever the maverick, the nonconformist nature of Peter Curtin resulted in him deserting his post fairly early in his enrollment. He was arrested within weeks thanks to his irrepressible urge to torch any structure with latent energy, and once again, Peter was behind bars. His punishment for the desertion would not have been that long, but soon the theft he committed while in Mulheim extended his stay in prison. Reports vary, but from what we can gather, he originally tried to win favor with the guards by telling on other inmates, which only resulted in him being looked down upon by both prisoners and guards. It was during this specific stint in prison that Peter developed an unquenchable hatred towards authority, the world, and humanity in general. He was reported to have been a difficult prisoner, biliterate and deviant to the extreme. Inmates would recall stories about Peter's sexual exploits that he would randomly and without asking tell to whoever was in earshot. He would refer to young women as veal, stating that sometimes an old goat needs green leaves. This hatred for everyone and everything would eventually become his motive for the crimes. He spent a lot of time in solitary confinement as well as chained up, but according to Peter, solitary confinement was preferable. His contrary demeanor would result in his stay in prison becoming even longer as the state originally determined. Peter found solace in the darkness and silence of his confinement, and we can assume that, as with his volatile family life, this experience added to the murderous state of mind of the man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf. He told Dr. Berg that while in solitary confinement, he would be able for the first time to immerse himself in the fantasies only imagined by this caliber of sexual sadist. Peter's release from jail in 1921 would coincide with the time soldiers would spend in battle, and under the lie of returning from the war front, Peter moved in with his sister in Altenburg. It is here that Peter would meet one of his sister's friends, Augusta Scharf. Augusta was a woman with her own troubled past, having spent 5 years in prison for shooting her lover to death when he refused to marry her after their 8-year affair. Partially due to the fact that she used to be a prostitute, her reputation did not gain favor, and since suitors were not beating down her door, she accepted Peter's advances. She originally refused to sleep with him, but he calmly informed her that if she didn't, he would stick a blade between her ribs, and in the same romantic tone, he eventually told her that she either marry him or he would kill her. Later, people would speculate that Peter did love his wife, but from all we've learned about psychopaths, this is impossible. He might be sentimental or familiar with a person, but there are no emotions or affections behind his actions. From the beginning, Peter was unfaithful, and although he did not reveal much about his domestic bliss, I firmly believe Augusta was violently abused and raped. She would convince a servant girl that Peter raped to lay charges and would tell the court that he choked the girl. Peter would tell her that this is what love is. He would spend a couple of months in jail, but by now, having racked up enough frequent flyer miles in prison, Peter was even more driven to cause devastation. I want to pause here and reflect on Peter's method of killing. Although he wanted to have total control in the situation, attacking men only when they are incapacitated, he seldom planned his attacks and chose random victims. It's difficult for me to tell whether his acts were truly impulsive or if his erratic behavior was part of his bloodthirsty dance. One of his survivors, Maria Schiefer, would give a little more insight, stating that his mood would constantly swing after the attack began. The two started off on a date, taking a stroll in the woods, when Peter suddenly tried to rape her, tearing her dress. He took her bag, which contained her keys, and when she started to cry, he became gentler. He would just as suddenly flip his personality, and by choking her, pulling out tufts of her hair, biting her, and pulling the earrings from her ears, exert his power over her. After the strange and violent interaction that would last for hours, Peter would finally let the exhausted and traumatized Maria leave. Needless to say, she was one of the lucky ones. Not much is written about this time after he married his wife in 1924. We can safely assume he set fires. He randomly attacked strangers, intending to commit grievous bodily harm, beat his spouse, and raped numerous people. He had steady work as a molder and even belonged to the trade union, fighting for better wages and working conditions. What is fatally apparent is that, during 1929, Peter would go on a rampage. Just like Arthur Shawcross, this sexual sadist would once again commit not just violent sexual attacks that left many disabled, but he would also torture and murder his prey. During 1929, Germany, as well as many other countries, buckled under the Great Depression. The currency value decreased daily, and with the threat of war on the horizon, Germany itself was in an economic crisis. It would also be the year Peter peaked in his predatory perversions. He would embark on a killing spree that would terrify the residents of Dusseldorf. On the 3rd of February 1929, Peter attacked Frau Coin, a middle-aged lady on her way home. Appearing from nowhere, he told her to keep quiet and then immediately started to stab the woman around her head, neck, and shoulders. Using a sharpened pair of scissors, he furiously stabbed her 24 times, at one point breaking off his blade in her body, and then fled the scene. Frau Kane miraculously survived and would be instrumental in giving a description of her attacker. On the 9th of February, Peter kidnapped an 8-year-old girl, Rosa Orlinger. He strangled and stabbed the young girl with what medical examiners described as small clusters of stab wounds in certain areas, such as her chest. It was clear that Peter had brutalized her, having inserted his fingers into her vagina as he did with Christine Klein. By now, Peter had found that stabbing his victim in the temple would create the kind of blood flow Peter lusted to drink. He would later admit that the metallic taste would excite him so much that he often drank from his victims until he got physically sick. He hid the body and left to get gasoline to set the little corpse on fire. Too many people were still milling around, and Peter left his urge to combine his two favorite thrills until the next morning, when he set his handiwork on fire. By the time police found her, her underwear was still smoldering, but her hair and skin had been scorched and blackened. Peter accosted his next victim, a middle-aged mechanic named Rudolf Scheer, when he, in a drunken haze, left a tavern late one evening. Using his favorite weapon, a hatchet, which he fondly referred to as his chopper, Peter inflicted 20 separate wounds, and once again, satisfied by the sight of blood, he fled the scene. He did, however, return to the scene of the crime, and like many serial killers after him, would try to claim having heard about the crime and tried to insert himself into the investigation. The 3 attacks piqued the interest of the police and the paranoia of the public. It was during this time that Germany had Detective Superintendent Ernst Jeanent as the head of their criminal investigations. Jeanent had quickly risen up the ranks, and it was clear he had a talent for catching monsters. He was, as a matter of fact, the first person to coin the term serial killer. His portly stature and quiet wisdom earned him the nickname the Buddha, and Peter's crimes quickly aroused his interest. Although he would eventually catch Peter, it would not be long before Peter unleashed more bloodshed on the streets of Dusseldorf. For whatever reason, Peter lay dormant for the next couple of months. What complicated the investigation even more was the false confession of a mentally ill man by the name of Johann Stausberg. The 20-year-old mentally challenged man had already been arrested for 2 attempted murders, very similar to the attacks Peter launched. He knew intimate details of the crimes, and since he was illiterate, police assumed he did not get the information from the newspapers. There would be no trial, and the young man was committed to a mental institution. In August, the urge to kill and the lust for blood overtook Peter with force. Sources vary on whether it was the 11th or the 14th, but it was during August when Peter, under a false name, befriended a young woman named Maria Hahn. They made plans after they met, and one afternoon, after visiting a beer garden and having something to eat, they took a stroll in the park. Without warning, once the two were alone, Peter attacked the woman, stabbing her repeatedly. His attack on her would last an hour as she pled with Peter to spare her life. Peter would later in his confession swear high and low that he never tortured his victims. What other word can we use to describe someone sitting on top of their victim, listening to her beg for her life, sucking her blood, and waiting for her to die? While drinking her blood from the gaping wound, Peter would admit that he lost control in the euphoria of drinking the ruby liquid to the point that it made him vomit. He hid the corpse and returned home, but his wife was unsettled by the large amount of blood on his clothes and asked questions regarding the stains, which, until now, Peter had avoided getting from his blood fests. Realizing that if her body was found, she would surely connect the dots, Peter returned to the body. He dug her up and, in a bizarre moment of madness, considered crucifying Maria's remains against a tree for spectators to find. He found the dead weight of the body too heavy. He reburied the body and would later write a taunting letter to the newspaper in November, telling them where they might find Maria's remains. He chose a spot near an abandoned factory and marked her informal grave with a cross. On the 21st of August, within the space of 1 hour, Peter would attack 3 victims, of which 2 were women and 1 a man. On the 25th of August, he would attack a young woman whom he had befriended, Gertrude Schultz. Fortunately, despite serious wounds, she would survive. The next 2 victims he attacked would not be so lucky. 14-year-old Louisa Lenzen and her 5-year-old sister Gertrude Hammaker had been attending the fair when they crossed paths with the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Using his usual charms, he convinced Louisa to leave Gertrude with him while she purchased him a packet of cigarettes. The moment the 14-year-old was out of sight, Peter grabbed Gertrude by the neck and started to choke the little girl. As she passed out, he started his mutilation with his trusty pocket knife. When her elder sister returned, Peter took the cigarettes from her, and he repeated the attack on her by strangling and stabbing her. Evidence would later reveal that no sexual interaction was had with either girl. Medical examiners would find bite marks on the children, noting that the neck wounds were near decapitations. Peter would confess to lying next to the children, delighting in the carnage he created. From August 1929 to May 1930, Peter would enter his hammer period, injuring 18 people and killing 3 more. It's as if his arrogance overtook his eagerness not to get caught, and as if the thrill of the hunt had become a compulsion. He met a 31-year-old servant girl named Ida Reuter at the station on the 30th of September 1930. At 48, Peter was a dashing gentleman, and using his charm, he convinced her to go to a cafe with him, and then to join him for a walk in the Hof Garden next to the River Rhine. It was clear he had intent because all along he had his hammer in his pocket. As before, the attack was sudden, and like Maria Hahn, Ida pled for her life, but Peter would mercilessly beat the woman before and after he raped her. 11 days later, on the 11th of October, he encountered a young woman named Elizabeth Rodier, and after savagely beating her with his hammer, he raped the woman and left her for dead. She would be found the next morning, still clinging to life, but alas, her injuries proved to be fatal. Peter had been stalking a 5-year-old girl called Gertrude Alberman, and on the 7th of November, he managed to take his chance and follow her into a deserted area. Not only would Peter strangle the young girl, but the autopsy would reveal 34 separate stab wounds. And then Peter went quiet again. We know of a couple of random attacks on people, but after this last murder, Peter lay low again. On the 14th of May 1930, a young woman by the name of Maria Bodlik arrived at Dusseldorf station. She was not familiar with the city and had commuted all the way to find work. She must have seemed a little lost when a man approached her and offered to help her find the hostel she was looking into. As the two walked, Maria realized that the area in which they were moving was not the right direction, and as she started to protest, a slender, well-dressed man appeared from nowhere, asking if he could perhaps be of some assistance. The first man who had accompanied Maria promptly left, possibly because his plans to rob or rape Maria had been spoiled, and the second gentleman offered Maria a place to stay for the night. This second man was Peter Curtin. Peter's wife had been out of town, and he had his dwelling all to himself that evening. Unable to restrain his urges, Peter made several advances to Maria, and she eventually opted to leave the apartment, choosing to sleep somewhere else. Peter offered to accompany her because there was a madman killing and raping women in Dusseldorf at the time. On their journey to the hostel, Peter suddenly attacked Maria and raped the young woman. He opted, however, not to kill her because he had been seen with her. Naturally, Maria was incredibly upset, but she decided not to go to the police to report the rape. She opted to write a letter to a friend of hers, explaining what happened to her. The letter, by pure coincidence, ended up in the hands of a stranger, and on reading the content, the good citizen immediately took the letter to the police. Police took Maria's statement, and through sheer luck, Maria remembered exactly what apartment Peter had taken her to. Accompanied by Superintendent Detective Ernst Genant and other law enforcers, the group made their way to the home of Peter Curtin. As the group came upon the landing joining the apartments, Peter happened to be passing Maria and for a moment recognized her attacker. Maria was frozen in fear. These moments in limbo were all he needed to make a getaway, and by the time Maria regained her voice, Peter fled the scene. Police were, however, convinced they had their suspect, and that it would be only a matter of time before the Vampire of Dusseldorf was behind bars. Peter could feel the sand running out of his hourglass of freedom and made arrangements to stay somewhere else. He decided to be kind of honest with his wife, telling her an extremely watered-down version of the crimes he had committed. Reports say that Peter, because he loved his wife, told her she should turn him in, claiming the reward. I think that she needed little more incentive after hearing that the abuse and sexual assault she had suffered for years was also inflicted on innocent strangers. They agreed to meet at a church the following day, and Augusta immediately went to the police to inform them of the rendezvous. Well aware that his identity had been discovered and that the meeting at the church would also curtail his surrender, Peter had a bath, shaved, and dressed in the immaculate fashion to which he was accustomed before making his way to the church. He freely gave himself up without fuss and was promptly arrested. He openly, and with a small amount of glee, recounted all his crimes, even solving the murder of Christine Klein, which had remained unsolved for almost 20 years. Dr. Carl Berg, who had taken a keen interest in the crimes of Peter Curtin long before his capture, finally got an opportunity to examine the mind of his deviant subject. Peter would show no remorse and relished in the retelling of his crimes. This confirmed to Dr. Berg that Peter was indeed a very dangerous sexual sadist, and that if he was not arrested, he would have continued destroying lives while satisfying his perverted sexual urges. On the 13th of April 1931, the trial of Peter Curtin began. During his trial, Peter had to be kept in a cage in court out of fear that loved ones of his victims would attack him. He was charged with 9 counts of murder and 7 of attempted murder. Despite the high victim count, the trial would only last 10 days. On the 22nd of April 1931, Peter Curtin was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 9 death sentences. Curtin had resigned himself to his fate and chose not to appeal the verdict. On the 1st of July 1931, Peter Curtin, flanked by the prison psychiatrist and a priest, made his way to the guillotine, which was erected especially for his execution. Just before he placed his head on the chopping block, Peter turned to Dr. Berg and asked, "Tell me, will I, for at least one moment, be able to hear the blood gush from the stump of my neck?" Dr. Berg told him that he will indeed, since the blood would continue to pump for at least a couple of seconds. To this, Peter exclaimed, "That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." When asked if there were any last words he had to offer, Peter only smiled and said, "No." Peter Curtin's head is currently housed for exhibition at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin. It had been donated after it had been dissected, but no abnormalities were found in the actual brain. The Vampire of Nuremberg. We have no desire to throw shade at Germany, but another lesser-known vampire horrified the Bavarian countryside for a year during 1971 and 1972. Although not as prolific, Kuno Hoffman's crimes might not have achieved him the notoriety of Peter Curtin, but his necrophiliac tendencies most definitely puts him in line for one of the most depraved murderers Germany had ever encountered. The true depravity of his deeds were first fully realized when, in April 1971, a mortuary attendant arrived at his post to find the naked corpse of a young girl posed against her coffin. Next to her were 2 burnt candles, and her neck was covered with bite marks. The other corpses had been removed from their coffins as well, and all were rearranged to face the naked corpse of the young woman. 3 days later, and 60 kilometers further, another funeral attendant would arrive at the mortuary he worked to find exactly the same macabre scene of a naked, bruised, and bitten young woman displayed against her coffin as other bodies were arranged in a sitting position, facing the ritualistic degradation. Until then, the only complaint had been the increasing number of mourners found that their beloved's jewelry had been stolen. This taunting, tampering, and display was very worrisome. Instead of unearthing a satanic cult, German authorities would find a short, awkward man. Kuno Hoffman had a rough start, very much like Peter Curtin. I have no doubt that the beatings his alcoholic father rained down on Kuno as a child played a part in the damaged psyche he would display later. It has been reported that his father beat him so badly that it was the official cause of his deafness and muteness. Born in 1931 in Nuremberg, Kuno was reported to be tied up in a bag and hung outside their dwelling's window from the age of 1 to be used as a punching bag. He struggled in school, most likely as a result of his disability and his social development and communication skills. His emotional growth was stunted as a result of his inability to express himself, but the abuse from his father increased his awkwardness. Unlike Peter, who was a Casanova of note, he was reported to have never had a romantic relationship, preferring the company of sex workers. Not much more is known about his youth, but his delinquency must have started early, as he was incarcerated for theft for 9 years, and also spent 9 years in a psychiatric facility, from where he attempted to escape a total of 12 times. It seems that after his release, Kuno was able to work at a factory. He also, during this time, became enthralled with the occult and black magic. The catalyst to his crimes would be identified as the innate desire to be handsome, stronger, and overall desirable. During his hours of exploring black magic literature, it seems he had stumbled on a spell that would make him irresistible to anyone. The spell required the drinking of a corpse's blood, and with this misguided information, Kuno set about in 1971 to procure the one ingredient vital to transform him into an Adonis. He began by breaking into mortuaries and funeral homes and stealing the keys for graveyards. Instead of just drinking the corpse's blood, which he did with vigor, he also mutilated the corpses in the most disturbing manner. He would not only cut and disfigure the corpses, but also take bites from the bodies and eat the rotting flesh. Often he would cut off the head and he would rape the woman and often disembowel corpses out of morbid curiosity. He loved posing the remains, either in the cemetery where he dug them up or in the mortuaries he found them. To ensure the freshness of his ritual ingredients, he would scour the local newspapers for death notifications. Armed with a blade, a shovel, his sunglasses, and his strange leather helmet, he would then go looking for the latest dead body to desecrate. He would visit the dead in morgues and dig up an astonishing 35 bodies before he was caught. He would escalate in order to get fresher blood, and during this time he committed 3 murders, of which I could only find information on 2. He encountered an engaged couple, Ruth Lissy, who was 18, and Marcus Adler, 24, one evening as the couple were sitting in a parked car. Kuno shot the couple, and he would later claim that Ruth's blood was the best he had ever tasted. He also raped the young woman's corpse. By now, the mutilation of corpses in the mortuary and the graveyard were correlated, and police knew they were dealing with the same villain. His desire for fresh flesh and blood was increasing, and as we've seen time and time again, the escalation would have continued if it was not for a graveyard attendant who saw the strange, greasy man with his bizarre headgear and bright red moped kissing a corpse he had recently dug up. Kuno wildly fired a shot at the attendant, jumped on his glorified bicycle, and drove off. But the man who was badly wounded by the passing bullet got a good enough look at his assailant, and quickly an identikit was drawn up. Kuno was arrested the following day at the factory where he was employed, ironically as he was handing in his resignation. He was charged with the 3 murders and desecration of corpses, and his insanity plea was thrown out the window, claiming that despite disability, low IQ, and loneliness, Kuno knew what he was doing, and that the crimes were so extraordinary that it deserved a life sentence. It is rumored that he was released in 2004, but not a single person could so far confirm it. I believe he would be too old and geriatric to dig up graves at this point, but if you see a strange little old man in a cemetery digging up a fresh grave, make yourself scarce just in case your blood ends up being the final ingredient in his eternal youth spell. The case of Peter Curtin was disturbing on so many levels, and his crimes so vicious that my mind almost wants to file it under fiction instead of fact. The fact that all of this happened almost 100 years ago can easily lull a person that this is a once-off event. But if you are a true crime nerd like me, you know that although the geography, method, and means might change, the animal called the sexual sadist has always found a place to hide in our society. It's a terrifying prospect to know that everywhere and anywhere, someone filled with rage and lust can be lurking, just waiting for the right moment to use, abuse, and kill you. Like an alcoholic, Peter was addicted to the sensation he felt once his senses had been stimulated by blood. Considering what we know about him, I have no doubt Peter would have made an excellent Nazi if he could have exercised self-control and bent his knee to authority. I do have some parting advice for all you Twilight, Vampire Diaries, and Buffy fans. Drinking blood is not good for you, and it can actually kill you due to the large amount of iron it contains. Bats have a custom-made digestive system in order for them to live on it as a main source of food, but a tablespoon a day for a human could cause kidney or liver failure. Besides, if it's that ghostly white pallor you are looking for to complete the ultimate gothic look, drinking blood is ill-advised because instead of lightening your pigments, it darkens it. Regardless, it's a really bad idea, and whatever you did to be able to get the blood in the first place is more than likely neither legal nor hygienic. The blood-sucking freaks might disagree, but we here at Human Monsters recommend you rather grab a beer or a smoothie before you choose a shot of plasma. David Harker. Darlington in the county of Durham in England on the surface looks like any other little quaint village in the United Kingdom, with all the charm a small town has to offer. Unfortunately, like almost everywhere in the world, the last couple of decades, a skid row infused with drug and alcohol abuse has sprouted in the small town. David Harker was a regular on the streets. His transient lifestyle and dependency on alcohol often led to him sleeping on the street or in the local park. Friends took pity on the 24-year-old alcoholic with his big icy blue eyes and handsome face, and eventually made space for him to sleep on their property. It was in this basement that Harker would commit an act so vile that it did not just cause the death of an innocent lost woman directly, but indirectly led to 2 other deaths. Those who knew him gave different accounts of what his personality was like. Generally, and especially if he had something to gain, Harker would be the perfect house guest. Others would, however, testify that the man with the words disorder and subhuman tattooed on his shaved head would easily lose his temper and erupt in rages, specifically when he was under the influence of alcohol. Instead of finding employment, he would panhandle to get money to buy booze, and his days were mostly spent drunk or passed out in the park. It's not clear how long or how well he knew 31-year-old Julie Patterson. Regulars in the area would say they saw them together a couple of times, and both would usually be blind drunk. Julie's life had gradually been spiraling out of control. Child welfare had previously taken away 3 of her children due to neglect, and a 4th she had with her current boyfriend, Alan Taylor, was also removed from her custody. Julie subsequently suffered from depression, and it wasn't unusual for her to vanish after a fight with Alan, the way she did on the evening of the 6th of April, 1998. The two often rowed, and she would always return. Alan noticed that she started missing appointments, such as picking up her government stipend and scheduled visits with her children. On the 26th of April, Alan reported Julie missing, and a search began. On the 16th of May, more than a month after her disappearance, Julie's dismembered torso was found discarded in an open field after neighbors complained about the terrible smell coming from the bag, which lay in an open lot. By this time, David Harker had told everyone, including his cousin, that he had strangled Julie, dismembered the corpse, had sex with the dead woman's corpse, and then cut strips from her thigh to fry it up with garlic butter and cheese, which he then enjoyed with his pasta. The problem with the claims he made to 25 people in total was that there was no way to tell that it was true. He was a liar who enjoyed boasting exaggerated claims, and only once, after blood evidence from the brutal attack and some of Julie's belongings were found at his living space, did he stop denying that he was with her. He refused to say anything more to police. Harker fancied himself a type of Hannibal Lecter, and he had a criminal psychology knowledge that could surpass seasoned investigators. The thrill-seeking psychopath made other claims. He claimed that he was severely abused from the age of 2 and claimed to have killed 2 other people. Authorities were unable to confirm any of these claims, and his family debunked them. They've also tried to see him in prison, but he refuses visitors. He also refused to cooperate with authorities in revealing where the rest of Julie's remains were. Obviously, this did not count in his favor, and he was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 14 years. I somehow doubt that he would easily get parole. Due to his lack of remorse, he refuses to tell what really happened during her murder, and because up to now he has done nothing to assist in finding Julie's head, legs, and arms, except writing riddles in letters to the newspaper, and being vague and misleading in his answers. Jim Patterson, Julie's father, had made several appeals for Harker to tell them where Julie's remains are, but the psychopath has nothing much to hold on to, so he is keeping that secret safe, to taunt the family. Frankly, if everyone spent the energy, effort, and concern about where her head and limbs were when she was alive, things might have turned out a little differently. Footage of Alan Taylor at Julie's grave is heartbreaking, and no one knew to what extent his grief had sunk. In 2006, Alan murdered his friend John Morrison by strangulation. When arrested, he insisted that he be transferred to the prison where Harker was held, asking authorities to place him in the same prison as Harker, and openly admitting that you committed the crime for no other reason might ironically be the best way for the law to keep you as far away from the intended victim as possible. After all, the law is supposed to prevent and not encourage crimes. 3 months after his arrest, Alan Taylor committed suicide in his cell. Even from behind bars, Harker's actions continue to ripple through the community. The Cannibal Cop. Perhaps not so much sweet as bitter, I want to leave you a dessert with this cautionary tale. Kathleen Vale was an average wife and mother, living with her husband and baby in an apartment in Queens, New York. Husband Gil had recently been promoted to sergeant at the NYPD, and by all accounts, he was a good father, husband, and police officer. Still, that female intuition that caused many a cheating man to be caught would just not leave her. She wanted to trust her husband, but the tingle down her spine would not subside, and she made a decision that would blow up like a limpid mine in their world. She installed spyware on his electronic devices. She just wanted to know if her husband was cheating, and instead, her world exploded. She systematically read through every message before she realized the extent of his online activity was much deeper and darker than she imagined. Officer Gil Vale had been living a double life. Offline, he was the charming, soft-spoken man everyone knew, but online, under the name Girl Meat Hunter, Officer Gil had a completely different persona. According to him, it was during a time he worked night shift and struggled to sleep that he started surfing the net for some adult entertainment. The difference is that what we view as online entertainment has a completely different meaning to Gil. Gil was obsessed with cannibalism. He stumbled purposefully onto a website called Dark Fetish Net. This forum created a platform for people to live out their most outrageous fantasies. What Kathleen read on those message boards and DMs was enough for her to grab her child, her belongings, and her baby and leave a man she loved, a home she cherished, and all the plans they had made for their future. He never saw her again. Kathleen would try to call him and say she wanted to work things out, but within a month she called the FBI. Gil was arrested on warrants for conspiracy to kidnap and accessing a database reserved for police officers to gain the physical address of one of his victims. He mentioned in these chats, specifically to a butcher from Pakistan called Ali Khan, that he would like to kidnap a young woman, rape, torture, cook, and eat her. Using photos of people he knew, including his wife, Gil would plan with his online conspirators the kidnapping and meal planning for his victims, which included a prosecuting attorney and old classmate. He wrote about kidnapping a woman, putting her in a suitcase, handing her to his friends as a gift to rape and torture, and then to cook and eat her. He had a document called Kimberly's Abduction and Consumption, a blueprint, in which he systematically outlines the abduction of his intended victim, including the stalking he had committed, a shopping list, including duct tape, rope, and chloroform, and how he would like to prepare the meat. He also stated that after his first date with his wife, he fantasized about kidnapping her, tying her up, and putting an apple in her mouth. During his first trial, he was found guilty on the charges brought against him, but the verdict was overturned during the appeal since no physical crime was committed. After 21 months in jail, Gil Vale is a free man, currently working in construction. The man called the Cannibal Cop, as the media has named him, still goes into the web, but swears high and low he only visits the dating apps. It's clear he's been through a lot, but personally, ladies should take extra precautions when dating this man with the disarming baby face. This episode was written by Misdemeanor. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.